Hello and welcome to week 3 in Suprasegmental Phonetics and English Pronunciation. Today we're going to kind of continue looking at units of pronunciation above the segment, right? Units that group segments together. Last week we learned about the syllable, the foot, and the word, and today we want to look in more detail about syllables. Right? Syllables really are the basic unit of speech. We do not pronounce individual segments, right? S, e, g, m, e, n, ts. Rather, we pronounce words as sets of syllables. So the word segment is pronounced segment, right? And they're put together, of course, but each breath that I take in and then the sounds I produce together, segment, right, are really sets of segments grouped into syllables. And so that's why we want to look in more detail at syllables. Okay? So the first thing to know is that syllables are these units of speech, right? And also that within syllables, we can divide the segments into syllable parts. And the term we use for these syllable parts are syllable constituents. And there are 4 different syllable constituents. Right? There's the onset and the rhyme, right? A syllable, and we use this Greek letter sigma to refer to a syllable. The syllable is divided into an onset and a rhyme. And you can see here that the onset is placed in parentheses to indicate it's an optional member of a syllable, whereas the rhyme is an obligatory member of every syllable. If there's no rhyme, there's no syllable. Some syllables also have an onset, but some syllables don't. Yeah? Likewise, the rhyme itself is further divided into smaller constituents, and those constituents are the nucleus and the coda. And here again, we see that one of them, the nucleus, is an obligatory member of the rhyme, and the coda is an optional member. There are syllables with a coda, and there are syllables without a coda. But there are no syllables without a nucleus. Every syllable must have a rhyme, every rhyme must have a nucleus. Okay? That's going to be a basic principle we see again and again. Right? So the syllable is divided into the onset and the rhyme is divided into the nucleus and the coda. And we're going to use that now with several examples, associating segments based on their rising and falling sonority into syllable structures. Now we're also going to look in more detail at the constituents, because some languages have optional constituents, like English. In addition, some languages have branching constituents, and English is one of these languages as well. So let's look in detail what branching constituents means. To branch, like a tree, you think of a tree has a trunk, and then it branches off. Right? Where you have separate branches of a tree is where it separates into kind of smaller sections of the tree. Well, a branching constituent is one that branches, that separates, and contains 2 segments. Now, the key here is it's exactly 2. A branching constituent does not have 3 or 4. A branching constituent does not have 1, but rather a branching constituent has 2 segments in this syllable position, in this syllable constituent. And this varies from language to language. Some languages allow branching constituents, some languages don't. English is an example where the onset of a syllable can be branching. We can have 2 segments in the onset of a syllable. Take, for example, the word clap. Right? It's made up of an obstruent, liquid, vowel, and obstruent. The sonority peak is the vowel, so it forms the nucleus of a syllable. The nucleus is in the rhyme of the syllable. Any segment before the nucleus of the syllable is in the onset of that syllable. And here's where the branching comes into play, because English allows onset clusters. two consonants together in a single onset constituent. And then the final obstruent is, of course, the coda of this syllable. So clap is a one-syllable word made up of an onset cluster and then a rhyme, ap. Okay. Now, branching constituents group together pairs of segments, and the segments are basically pronounced simultaneously. They're not really two separate constituents. It's one constituent that contains two segments. But some of the segments are shorter in duration than the others. So in the word clap, for example, the k sound is very brief, very short. The ul sound is a little bit longer. It's not very long, but it's a little bit longer. The a, of course, is longer still. But the a does not begin at the same time as either the ul or the k. However, when I pronounce clap, you can almost see k at the same time that the tongue at the back of the mouth is touching to make a k. The front of the tongue is in position for the L. Right? So it's cl, cl. The two sounds are pronounced at the same time, but it sounds like there's a sequence simply because of the difference in the durations of the two segments. Now, when there are two consonants in a branching constituent, we use the term cluster. So that could be an onset cluster if the two consonants are in the onset of a syllable. It could be a coda cluster if there are two consonants in the coda of a syllable. And if we're talking about a pair of vowels in a branching nucleus, well, then we're going to be talking about either a diphthong or a long vowel. In a diphthong, two different vowels appear in the two positions of a branching nucleus. In a long vowel, it's the same vowel that is associated with two positions in a branching nucleus. So whether we refer to these branching constituents as a cluster or as a diphthong depends on the segments contained in them. So let's look at some segments in syllables. And we saw this briefly last week. I want to do it in much more detail this week with several examples. So take the word lamb, for example. It's important to remember we are interested in the sounds, not the spelling. So although the word lamb is spelled with four letters, L-A-M-B, there is no b in the pronunciation. It's really just three segments, ul, a, m. Right? The ul is a liquid, the a is a vowel, and the m is a nasal. So sonority rises from the first to the second segment and then falls to the third segment. Therefore, it forms a sonority peak. It rises to the vowel, falls to the nasal. Okay? So that sonority peak is associated with the nucleus of a syllable. Every nucleus, of course, is in the rhyme of a syllable. And then we move on to the next rule of syllable structure, which is that any segment before the nucleus of a syllable is in the onset of that syllable. So in this case, the L, the L, the lateral approximant, is a segment before the nucleus of a syllable, so it's the onset of that syllable. And then finally, any remaining segments that are neither included in the nucleus nor in the onset may, in most cases, be included as the coda of the previous syllable. Right? So the M in this case comes after the nucleus, but it's not the onset of a following syllable, so it's included in this syllable as the coda of the syllable. Okay, so branching constituents allow two segments in the constituent, and we've seen already the word clap. Right? Now, it's not any pair of consonants that can appear in a branching onset or in a branching coda. In fact, there are limits on the sequence of segments, And those limits will be different for different languages. So in the case of English, a branching onset must have increasing sonority from the first consonant to the second consonant. Not only must there be increasing sonority, but the degree of difference between them must be at least 2 points on the sonority scale. So an obstruent is at the bottom, nasal is just 1 point higher. Obstruent liquid would be 2 points higher. Obstruent glide would be 3 points higher. So that's what I mean by degree of difference in sonority. And so for any sequence of consonants in an onset, the first one must have lower sonority than the second one. And you can see this in English examples like the words twin, queen, cute, beautiful. These are all words beginning with an onset cluster made up of an obstruent followed by a glide. Well, obstruent is at the bottom, so obstruent to nasal is 1, to liquid is 2, to glide is 3, so that meets this requirement that the difference be at least 2 points on the sonority scale. Okay? The same is true for words that begin with an obstruent liquid cluster. Words like prize, blend, great, clean. Okay? In this case, the liquid is 2 points higher on the sonority scale from the obstruents, which is within the limit required. But if I were to consider either obstruent obstruent or obstruent nasal sequences, well, there's not sufficient difference in sonority for that to make an acceptable branching onset. And the same would be true for nasal to liquid. Nasal to liquid is only a difference of 1. Nasal to glide, nasal liquid glide, well, that would be a difference of 2, and that would be enough to form a branching onset in a word like music, right? We saw before. Liquid to glide, right? Liquid to glide. Oh, right. The asterisk means it's not possible. So liquid to glide is only a difference of 1. Now, all of these are possible in other languages, right? So the KT example, obstruent obstruent, right, exists in Greek, but not in English. The PN, pn, exists in French as well as Greek. The ML, ml, so nasal liquid, in Czech, they have a ml pronunciation. Loi, liquid glide. French has liquid glide. Right? The word for law is la loi. So languages will differ in the well, first of all, languages differ in whether they allow branching onsets or not. Japanese, for example, does not allow branching onsets. English does allow branching onsets. So does French. So does Greek. But among the languages that allow branching onsets, there are differences in the requirements of sonority, that the relationship between adjacent segments in terms of their sonority. Okay. Right, and importantly, for English, that difference is a minimum of 2 points on the sonority scale. Now, coda clusters, consonants that are in 2 positions of a branching coda, have a different rule. In fact, in some sense, it's kind of the reverse rule, the opposite rule. So a branching coda must not have increasing sonority from the first to the second consonant in the branching coda. They may have either the same degree of sonority, or the second consonant can have lower sonority than the first. And so we see examples like liquid obstruent coda clusters, like in the word card. Is a liquid, d is an obstruent. Help, LP, help, liquid obstruent coda cluster. Dark, court. In each case, the liquid has higher sonority than the obstruent. But they can be the same degree of sonority as well. So desk, right, sk, are both obstruents. Lost, act, slept. Right? So as long as there's not increasing sonority from the first consonant to the second consonant, the sequence is an acceptable one for branching codas. In fact, that's not exactly true. We'll come back later and see that for example, a sequence of nasals are not possible. You can't have two nasals form, but there's a separate reason for that, and we'll come back to that later. But what we certainly cannot have is rising sonority. So for example, obstruent liquid sequences would never form a branching coda. Now we have words in English that have an obstruent followed by a liquid, but the two segments are always in different syllables, right? Well, they're either in a branching onset or they're in different syllables. So for example, the word atlas, the T is in the first syllable, it's the coda of the first syllable, and the L is in the onset of the second syllable. It can't be a branching coda. Now you might wonder, why isn't it a branching onset, right? Because TR can form an acceptable branching onset. But there is a specific rule that prevents the T and the L to form a branching onset. And again, that will come back to later. Okay? But for now, in terms of sonority, onset clusters must have rising sonority with a difference of at least 2 points on the sonority scale. Branching codas must not have rising sonority. Okay. Now, turning to the nucleus is part of the rhyme, and for that reason, its restrictions resemble the coda restrictions. A branching nucleus must not have increasing sonority from the first vowel to the second vowel. And as a result, when we have diphthongs, the first vowel always has greater sonority. It's an open vowel, it's either a low vowel or a mid vowel, and then the second vowel tends to be a high vowel. Right? And remember, high vowels have a little bit less sonority. They have the same degree of sonority as glides. As a result, we're getting a sequence of two segments in which the sonority is going from higher to lower in the branching nucleus. I, ow, and even oi. If I were to reverse those, right, if I were to put a high vowel followed by a low vowel, what you see in red, for example, those are not possible because they violate this restriction on the sequence of segments in a branching constituent. And in the case of long vowels, it's the same vowel in both positions. Well, that meets the requirement that there is not rising sonority. It's level sonority. It's not falling sonority, but it's clearly not rising sonority. And so it falls within the range of sonority patterns that are permitted in a branching constituent within the rhyme. It's the same restriction in the nucleus and in the coda. The difference is simply that the nucleus tends to have vowels and the coda tends to have consonants. I say tends to because we'll see some slight exceptions to that later on. Oh, here I just wanted to remind you that if you're referring to dictionaries, sometimes these diphthongs are written with the letter J to reflect the glide pronunciation of I, oi, ow, or a, o. The symbols I use, which are those that are on the left of the slide, are the IPA symbols for representing diphthongs. But the pronunciation is exactly the same. It's simply a difference in how to write them. Okay. The same is true for long vowels. In the IPA, we use the two dots to represent longer vowel. But in fact, there is a slight movement of the tongue, right? E, E. And so dictionaries that like to represent that change rely on the glide symbol, the letter J, to make that clear, right? Or the letter W in the case of the high back vowel, oo, oo, E. Yeah. But for the rest of this course, I will be using the symbols you see on the left, which are the IPA symbols for diphthongs. Now, different languages permit different constituents to branch. A language like English allows lots of branching. Some languages allow no branching at all. Right? So the language that is native to the Hawaiian Islands, the Hawaiian language, has no branching constituents. It has an onset and it has a rhyme, and the rhyme contains a nucleus, but the rhyme does not branch into a nucleus and a coda. As a result, all Hawaiian words are consonant vowel, consonant vowel, consonant vowel. Now, several languages allow the rhyme to branch, and Japanese and English both allow the rhyme to branch. Any language that includes coda as a possible syllable position is allowing the rhyme to branch. So we saw these examples last week. English active, the k is in the coda, which shows us that the branching rhyme is an acceptable syllable type. Likewise, ongaku, the the nasal in ongaku, is part of the first syllable. It's in the coda of the first syllable. Some languages allow the onset to branch. We've seen already the example clap, but bread, quote, right? There are a number of different sequences permitted. And we also have branching codas. And English is an example that allows branching codas in addition to branching onsets. So we have words like send, right? Nd, nd, 2 segments in the coda. Part, lamp. Okay. It's possible to have a word that has both branching onset and branching nucleus. Right? A word like crank, crank. So even though there are 5 segments, k, a, n, k, crank, right? It's one syllable. One syllable with 2 branching constituents. Okay? Well, 3 branching constituents. Right? The rhyme branches into the nucleus and the coda. The onset branches into 2 segments. The coda branches into 2 segments, but there's 1 segment in the nucleus, crank. Right? Blend would be the same. Draft would be the same. Right? Each of these has a branching onset and a branching coda. It's even possible to find examples of all constituents branching. Right? So we've already seen that branching nucleuses are those with diphthongs, like boy, hi, now. Right? Or in the Japanese examples from last week, we saw long vowels represent branching nucleuses, like kino, kayobi, 10月. In English, we have words in which all of the constituents branch. A word like ground, gr, ow, nd. Right? 6 segments grouped into 3 constituents. Each one is a branching constituent. The same is true for blind, bl, I, nd, blind. Right? So you can see already there's a big difference in how many segments can appear within a syllable depending on whether or not the language permits branching constituents. Hawaiian, for example, has a maximum of 2 segments in the syllable, 1 in the onset, 1 in the nucleus. In English, you've already seen we can have 6 segments in a single syllable, 2 segments in each of the 3 constituents, onset, nucleus, and coda. And we'll see later there's a special case where we can have even more segments within a single segment. Okay, so to summarize the main points for this part of the lecture, syllables, as we saw from last week and again this week, are built around a sonority peak in a sequence of segments. The sonority of segments are changing one to the next. Every time sonority rises and begins to fall, that segment that forms a sonority peak is the basis, the nucleus of a syllable. And then any segment before that sonority peak, before the nucleus of a syllable, is in the onset of that syllable. And finally, any remaining segment will appear in the coda of the syllable. Now, we saw today that English and a number of other languages allow some of the constituents to branch, to contain two segments, where other languages allow only one segment. And in English, it's all four constituents that may branch. It doesn't mean they must branch. There are many words where there's no branching constituents, but branching constituents are possible. When the consonants appear in branching constituents, we refer to that as a consonant cluster, or simply a cluster, an onset cluster or a coda cluster. When there are vowels together in a branching nucleus, then they form a diphthong. Well, they're a diphthong if they are two different vowels. Okay, in the next video, we're going to get some practice looking at this tree structure we use for representing syllables. Okay? See you there.